At 2:17 a.m., Ethan Hale woke up without fear, without noise, without reason. His eyes opened the way they do when a thought arrives before a dream can finish. The room around him was dark and unfamiliar, yet the feeling in his chest was deeply personal. He didn't reach for his phone this time. He didn't need confirmation. Somewhere, a place he had abandoned was still awake, and it had finally decided to remind him. The realization didn't make his heart race. That surprised him. He had always imagined that if the past ever caught up to him, it would arrive loudly, violently, the way it does in movies. Instead, it settled over him with the calm certainty of something that had never stopped belonging to him. Ethan lay still for several minutes, listening to the quiet breathing of his apartment. The building around him felt thin, temporary. Walls like these were meant to be forgotten, replaced, abandoned without consequence. They had no memory, no expectations. The house did. He sat up slowly and swung his legs over the side of the bed. The floor was cool beneath his feet, grounding him in the present moment, even as his mind drifted backward. He stood there longer than necessary, rubbing his hands together, feeling the faint stiffness in his fingers that came with age and poor sleep. 13 years, he thought. That was how long it had been since he'd left without looking back. He dressed without turning on the light, movements careful and quiet as if someone else might be sleeping nearby. There was no one. There never was. He had grown used to that part of his life, had even learned to appreciate the simplicity of it. But tonight, the silence felt incomplete. The drive took longer than it should have, though he couldn't have said why. Traffic was light, the roads familiar, yet strangely distorted by memory. Each turn felt rehearsed, his hands moving on the steering wheel before his conscious mind caught up. He hadn't looked up the address. He hadn't needed to. The street lamp at the corner flickered as he turned onto the old road, casting uneven shadows across the pavement. His chest tightened at the sight of it. That lamp had always been unreliable, even when he was a teenager. Some things, apparently, resisted repair. He parked across the street from the house instead of in front of it. The choice felt instinctive, defensive. From here, he could see the entire structure without committing himself to it. The porch, the windows, the roofline that dipped slightly on the left side, a flaw his father had promised to fix and never had. The house was dark. No lights, no movement. It blended into the night in a way that made it feel less like a building and more like a presence. Ethan lay still for the car, with the engine off, listening to the faint ticking of cooling metal. He told himself he was giving his nerves time to settle, but the truth was simpler. He was waiting for the house to react. It didn't. After a while, he didn't check how long, he opened the car door and stepped out. The air smelled of damp earth and old leaves. Autumn was always his least favorite season here. Everything looked like it was in the process of letting go. Gravel crunched under his shoes as he crossed the street. The sound felt too loud, too intrusive. He slowed his steps, then shook himself at himself. This was ridiculous. It was just a house, an empty one most likely. Still, he found himself climbing the porch steps with care, distributing his weight the way he used to when he came home late as a teenager. The wood responded with a soft groan, not angry, not welcoming, acknowledging. The front door loomed in front of him, paint chipped, handle dull with age. He reached into his pocket and froze when his fingers brushed metal. The key. He had brought it without thinking. Holding it now, he felt a sudden, sharp wave of doubt. Keys were symbols of permission, of belonging. He wasn't sure he deserved either. But his hand moved anyway, guiding the key toward the lock. It slid in smoothly. No resistance, no hesitation. The lock turned with a soft click that echoed louder than it should have. Ethan pushed the door open and stepped inside, the air immediately shifting around him, cooler, denser, as if the house maintained its own internal climate, separate from the world outside. He closed the door behind him, and the sound of it settling into place sent a quiet shiver through his spine. Inside, the darkness was complete, but familiar. He didn't need light to know where he was. His body remembered the layout, even if his mind pretended not to. He slipped off his shoes and placed them neatly by the door, the old habit rising without permission. The floorboard beneath his bare foot creaked softly. Ethan paused, breath held, listening. The house answered with silence, but it was a silence that felt aware, stretched thin over something deeper. He had the unsettling impression that by crossing the threshold, he had completed a long-delayed conversation. And for the first time since waking at 2:17 a.m., he felt certain of one thing. The house wasn't angry. It was patient. Ethan stood just inside the doorway longer than necessary, as if the house needed time to adjust to his presence. The darkness didn't thin when his eyes adapted. It stayed dense, layered, like something that could be peeled back if he reached for it. He didn't. Instead, he breathed in slowly, letting the smell settle into him. Dust, old wood, the faint trace of something once cooked regularly and then abandoned. Memory lived in places like this, not loudly, but persistently. He took a step forward. The hallway accepted him without resistance. His feet knew where to land, avoiding the softer spots in the floor without conscious instruction. That disturbed him more than the silence. Muscle memory should fade after 13 years. This one hadn't. The walls on either side felt closer than they used to. He brushed his fingers against the paint, half expecting it to be colder than the air. It wasn't. It was neutral, almost warm, like skin that had adjusted to the room. Somewhere deeper in the house, something shifted. Not a sound exactly, more like a change in pressure. Ethan stopped again, heart slowing instead of speeding up. Fear would have been easier to understand. This felt like recognition. He moved toward the living room, guided by habit rather than sight. Moonlight filtered in through the front window, just enough to outline familiar shapes. The couch was still there, its back slightly sagging in the middle. The coffee table bore the same shallow scratch near one leg, the result of an argument long resolved and never spoken of again. He lowered himself onto the couch carefully, testing its strength. It held. Everything did. The house hadn't weakened in his absence. If anything, it felt preserved, as though time had slowed inside these walls while the rest of the world rushed forward without him. Ethan leaned back and closed his eyes. The first memory arrived uninvited. He was younger, late teens maybe, lying on this same couch, staring at the ceiling while the house settled around him. He remembered counting the sounds at night, the click of cooling pipes, the faint groan of wood adjusting, the almost audible pause that came right before everything went quiet. Back then, he'd been convinced the house was listening to him think. He opened his eyes. The ceiling above him looked unchanged. Same faint discoloration near the corner. Same barely visible crack running like a fault line toward the light fixture. He wondered how many nights it had watched him sleep, how many thoughts it had overheard and stored away. "I didn't plan to come back," he said softly, the sound of his voice strange in the stillness. The house didn't answer. It didn't need to. He stood and moved deeper inside, toward the kitchen. The doorway felt narrower than it should have, as if the space itself had leaned inward. The refrigerator hummed quietly, and the sound startled him. He hadn't expected anything to still work. He opened it. Empty. Clean. Too clean. No forgotten containers, no expired bottles. It was as though someone had prepared the house for a visit that never came. The realization sent a thin line of unease through him. Ethan closed the door and leaned against the counter,
rubbing his face. Fatigue pressed down on him now, heavier than it had been all night. This was the kind of tiredness that didn't come from lack of sleep, but from resisting something inevitable. The stairs waited at the end of the hallway. He hadn't intended to go up yet. The upper floor carried weight, history concentrated into smaller rooms, but his feet turned that way anyway, guided by the same invisible pull that had brought him here. The first step creaked, the second didn't. He remembered that pattern. He remembered how as a teenager he'd learned exactly where to place his feet to avoid waking the rest of the house. That knowledge rose up now, precise and unasked. Halfway up, he stopped. The air changed again, growing heavier, warmer. He felt it in his lungs, a subtle resistance to each breath. Not hostile, protective, as if the house was closing around something it had kept safe for too long. His bedroom door stood at the end of the hall, slightly open. That was wrong. He was certain he'd closed it the last time he was here, certain enough that the sight of it unsettled him more than any sound could have. He approached slowly, every sense alert now, every instinct sharpened. The room beyond was dark, but intact. His bed still occupied the far wall, the frame older, the mattress thinner than he remembered. The desk sat beneath the window, its surface bare. The chair was pushed in neatly. Someone had been here. The thought landed heavily, then dissolved. No, that wasn't right. There was no sign of intrusion, no disruption. Everything was exactly as he left it, just maintained. Ethan stepped inside.
Ethan remained seated on the edge of the bed, hands resting loosely on his knees, breathing slow and deliberate. The room felt closer now, not smaller, but more attentive, as if the walls had leaned in just enough to listen better. He didn't look at the door. He already knew it was still open, the same careful inch, neither inviting nor refusing. He lay back slowly, testing the mattress the way someone tests unfamiliar water. It accepted him without protest, springs quiet, surface firm in a way modern beds never were. The ceiling above him hovered in the dim light, unchanged, unblinking. He wondered how many nights he had stared at it, trying to imagine a future that didn't include this place. Sleep brushed against him, light and tentative, not the heavy pull he was used to, but something cautious, as though even rest was waiting for permission. His eyes closed, then opened again almost immediately. The house shifted. Not a sound, no creak, no knock, but a subtle rebalancing, like weight being redistributed. Ethan felt it through the bed frame, through the floor beneath, through his own bones. His pulse slowed in response, sinking to something older and steadier than his own rhythm. "I'm here," he said, barely above a breath. The words didn't echo. They didn't need to. He sat up again, drawn by a sense of unfinished movement. On the far side of the room, the closet door stood closed, its surface smooth and pale in the low light. He stared at it, unsure when it had last held his attention. He couldn't remember opening it before leaving all those years ago. He couldn't remember closing it either. He stood and crossed the room. Each step felt measured, deliberate, as if the floor itself was counting them. His hand hovered near the knob for a moment before making contact. The metal was cool, but not cold. The door opened easily. Inside, the closet was nearly empty. No clothes hung from the rod, no boxes cluttered the floor. Only one object remained, placed carefully against the back wall. A small cardboard box. Ethan crouched, knees creaking softly, and pulled it toward him. Dust lifted as it moved, hanging briefly in the air before settling again. He recognized the box immediately, though he couldn't have said why. Some things announce themselves without explanation. He opened it.
Inside lay a stack of notebooks, their covers worn, edges softened by use. His handwriting stared back at him, uneven and slanted, younger and more impatient than he remembered being. He lifted the top notebook and flipped it open. The first page was blank. The second wasn't. Words filled it from margin to margin, written late at night, pressed hard enough to leave impressions on the pages beneath. He read slowly, the phrases tugging at something deep and uncomfortable. I can hear the house when it thinks I'm asleep. It doesn't make sounds, not really. It pauses, like it's checking if I'm still here. Ethan swallowed. He turned the page. If I leave, will it notice right away? Or will it keep waiting, thinking I'm just late? The air in the room felt heavier again, thickening around his shoulders. He closed the notebook and returned it to the box, then stood, leaving the closet door open. The knowledge settled into him with quiet certainty. He hadn't imagined it back then. The house had been aware of him long before he understood how to name that awareness. He moved back into the hallway, drawn by a pressure that felt directional, almost guiding. The bathroom door across from his room was ajar, lightless but expectant. He pushed it open and stepped inside. The mirror above the sink reflected him faintly, features softened by shadow. He studied his face, the lines at the corners of his eyes, the subtle sag of skin that spoke of years spent avoiding mirrors like this one. He looked older, but not unfamiliar. He looked like someone who had been carrying something.
Ethan didn't wake so much as surface. His eyes opened slowly, lids heavy, as if sleep had weight and didn't want to release him all at once. The room was still dark, unchanged, yet the quality of the darkness felt different, less watchful, more settled. His breathing remained deep for a few moments before he became aware of it, and when he shifted slightly, there was no immediate tension in his body, no urgency, no pull. That alone felt unfamiliar. He stayed where he was, lying on the bed, listening. The house was quiet in a way that felt earned, not imposed. The silence had layers still, but they were resting layers now, folded rather than stretched thin. He had the sense of having arrived at the middle of something rather than the beginning or the end. He sat up and rubbed his face, palms warm against his skin. His thoughts felt slower, heavier, like furniture that had finally been set down after being carried too far. When he swung his legs over the side of the bed, the floor remained still beneath his feet. No creak, no acknowledgement this time. That, too, felt intentional. He stood and glanced at the closet. The door was still open, the box still where he'd left it. He didn't feel compelled to touch it again. What it held had already done its work for now. Some truths didn't need repetition. Downstairs, the living room waited without pressure. The couch, the table, the windows, all of it felt less like a museum and more like a place that had resumed breathing after a long pause. He crossed to the front window and pulled the curtain aside slightly. The street outside was empty, the sky beginning to soften at the edges. Dawn was still some distance away, but the night had begun to loosen its grip. He checked his phone out of habit, the screen lighting his face briefly. 2:18 a.m. The number sat there without significance now, no tightening in his chest, no sharp awareness, just time, moving forward the way it was supposed to. He lowered the phone and let his forehead rest lightly against the glass. The coolness grounded him, tethered him to the present moment. For the first time in a long while, he felt the quiet confidence of someone who hadn't fled from his own thoughts. Behind him, the house shifted, not in response, but in accompaniment, a shared movement, a parallel adjustment. "I'm not leaving tonight," he said softly. The words felt careful but firm, shaped by honesty rather than impulse. Saying them didn't spark anxiety, it brought relief. He moved toward the kitchen and poured himself a glass of water from the tap. The sound of it filling the glass felt ordinary in the best way. He drank slowly, then set the glass down and leaned back against the counter, eyes half closed. Memories came again, but differently now, not sharp, not demanding. They drifted through him with the distance of things that had already been acknowledged. He remembered mornings here, quiet ones, before school, before arguments, before he learned how to leave emotionally, long before he left physically. He wondered when exactly that had happened. Not the departure, but the detachment. The house had felt it before he had. He carried the glass into the living room and set it on the table, then lowered himself onto the couch. This time, when he leaned back, the fabric felt supportive rather than sagging. He closed his eyes and let his head rest against the cushion. Sleep returned almost immediately. It wasn't deep or consuming. It hovered close, like a trusted presence waiting to be invited. Ethan didn't analyze it, he simply allowed it, letting his breathing slow, his thoughts loosen their grip. A faint sound filtered through the quiet then, wind moving through branches outside, brushing against the house's exterior. The structure responded with a subtle settling, not alarmed, not alert, just responsive. He slept. Not long, not deeply, but honestly. When he opened his eyes again, the darkness had thinned. Early light pressed faintly against the windows, turning shadows softer, less absolute. The house felt different in daylight's approach, not diminished, but complete, like something that had finished a long-held task. Ethan sat up, joints stiff but manageable, and stretched slowly. His body registered the passage of time without protest. He felt present in it, anchored. He stood and walked the perimeter of the room, touching the backs of chairs, the edge of the bookshelf, the wall near the staircase. Each contact felt like a closing loop rather than a reopening wound. The house didn't resist, it didn't cling. At the base of the stairs, he paused. "I won't disappear again," he said, choosing the words carefully. The air held that statement without reaction. Acceptance didn't need confirmation. He moved toward the kitchen and retrieved his shoes from by the door and slipped them on, the action feeling neither hurried nor hesitant. When his hand rested on the doorknob, he paused one last time, not out of fear, but respect. "I'll come back," he said. This time it felt like a promise rather than a test. He opened the door and stepped outside. The cool air greeted him, fresh and awake, carrying the faint sounds of a world resuming its routines. He turned and looked at the house in the growing light. It stood quietly, unchanged in shape, altered in presence, complete.
Ethan walked down the quiet street, his steps deliberate, unhurried, the morning air crisp against his skin. The sky above was a pale gray, the kind that feels as if it's holding its breath before a storm. Yet there was no storm, only the faint hum of early traffic in the distance, the rustle of leaves stirred by a lazy breeze. The house behind him remained still, silent and yet present, as if it had followed him all the way to the edge of the yard without moving an inch. He didn't glance back again. He didn't need to. Some presences are felt, not seen. The drive back to his apartment was slower than necessary. Roads he had traversed 1,000 times felt different now, lined with trees that seemed taller, houses that seemed closer together, and shadows that reached farther than they should have. He remembered the night he had left, 13 years ago, how he had turned the key in the lock with a sense of finality, how he had convinced himself that absence would erase his presence, but it never had. Even as the years passed, the house had remembered him. It had waited. He parked outside his apartment building and sat in the car for a moment longer, hands on the wheel, allowing the weight of the night to settle fully into him. The air inside the car was cooler than the early morning outside, carrying the faint scent of damp leather from the seats. He breathed slowly, eyes half closed, thinking of the notebooks he had seen in the closet. Every line of his younger self's writing had seemed to reach through time,
to touch him in a way that was both uncomfortable and necessary. The house had been patient, but it had not been idle. It had preserved him, and in return, he had allowed it to shape the edges of his memory. When he finally climbed out of the car and unlocked his apartment door, the interior felt immediate and present, as if it had been waiting for him in the same way. The light from the living room stretched across the floorboards, warm and forgiving. He left the door slightly ajar behind him, letting a thin line of the outside world spill into the quiet interior. It was a small acknowledgement that life continued elsewhere, that there were rhythms beyond his own, yet here, too, life was steady and deliberate. He walked to the kitchen and filled a glass with water, the cool liquid sliding down his throat with an ease that surprised him. He thought of breakfast, though he didn't prepare one immediately. Instead, he moved to the window and looked out at the street below, watching the few early commuters begin their routines. The world was waking, but it did so slowly, almost in deference to the lingering darkness he had left behind. He wondered if the house still lingered in his mind in the same way, whether it waited for him as he had waited for the night to arrive. Returning to the living room, Ethan sank into his chair, stretching legs and arms in a slow, deliberate manner. He allowed his mind to drift, letting memories float up without demand or urgency. He saw himself as a teenager again, restless and impatient, moving through the house, noticing sounds that others would ignore. He remembered the creak of floorboards underfoot, the subtle shift of air near the windows, the way shadows pooled in corners with the weight of attention. Every detail had mattered then, and it still mattered now, though the urgency had softened into a quiet reverence. A subtle sound drew him from his recollections, not loud, not abrupt, but a faint adjustment in the air, a settling, like a curtain of stillness being drawn back slightly. He inhaled, noticing it, and realized it was not outside. It was the house itself, present and aware in a way that was unmistakable, yet devoid of hostility. Ethan had never truly believed he would return, but now that he had, the house's presence was no longer a matter of speculation. It was concrete, almost tactile. He could feel it in the space around him, in the weight of the walls and the subtle pressure of the ceiling overhead. He stood again and moved slowly through the apartment, hands brushing surfaces lightly, feeling textures, confirming existence. The room responded with quiet stillness, as though it acknowledged him without needing to react. He reached the bedroom and paused, glancing at the bed where he had slept the night before, where he had finally allowed rest without resistance. It seemed different in daylight, softened by shadow, yet it was exactly the same. Consistency, he realized, had been the gift of the house. It had preserved what was essential, leaving the rest to his imagination. He moved to the closet and peeked inside. The box of notebooks had been moved, presumably by him, the night before. He opened the top notebook and flipped through it, letting the lines of his youth brush against him. Memories flowed naturally this time, unforced, unweighted. He didn't feel guilt, only recognition. The house had waited for him to see these pages again, and in doing so, it had completed something unspoken. The patient architecture of his past and the tangible weight of memory had converged into a space where acknowledgement replaced absence. He closed the notebook and replaced it in the box. He moved to the window again, pulling aside the curtain slightly. The street below was brighter now, pedestrians moving with purpose, cars rolling by without hesitation. He felt a subtle separation.
Ethan drove slowly, letting the engine hum beneath him as the streets stretched ahead in the early light. The city was quieter than he remembered at this hour. The usual morning rush softened into something almost serene. The sound of tires rolling on asphalt, punctuated only by distant footsteps and the occasional bird. He kept his windows slightly open, letting the cool air move through the car, carrying the faint scent of damp concrete and fallen leaves. It felt grounding, a tether to the present,
even as the memory of the house clung to him, not heavy, not demanding, only persistent. He didn't take the familiar route home. Instinct guided him through quieter streets, narrow lanes that twisted unexpectedly, bordered by houses older and straighter than his own. The trees here leaned overhead, creating tunnels of muted light and shadow, their branches brushing lightly against one another. Each movement of the leaves seemed deliberate, timed, as if the neighborhood itself had paused to observe him, to mark his return to normalcy with gentle awareness. As he drove, he thought of the notebooks again. The lines of his younger self's handwriting had been uneven, impatient, full of unfinished sentences and questions that had gone unanswered. Yet the questions were not important anymore. The presence of the house had provided answers in silence, in patience, in waiting. There had been no urgency, no confrontation, only acknowledgement. He realized he had expected confrontation, some visible mark of judgment, and instead he had received understanding, a presence that had endured the years without resentment. He turned another corner, and the sun began to break past the horizon, brushing the city with light that was muted and diffused, never harsh. The houses glowed softly in the early morning, the windows catching flecks of light, reflecting them into the streets. Ethan felt a subtle calm spread through him, a quiet appreciation of how the world continued its rhythms, even as his own life had undergone disruption, delay, and return. Each breath he drew felt slower, more deliberate, more fully his. Pulling into his apartment building, he parked in a space he had chosen carefully, not closest to the entrance, not farthest, but somewhere in between, a midpoint that felt balanced. As he stepped out, he let the car door close behind him slowly, savoring the sound it made as it shut. The weight of the morning seemed tangible, settling into his shoulders and spine, reminding him that the past could be acknowledged without fear, that presence could be restored without coercion. He unlocked the building door, each turn of the key deliberate, conscious. The familiar click of the lock echoed faintly in the hall, harmonizing with the faint hum of the elevator. He paused before stepping inside, breathing deeply, aware of the moment, the space, the rhythm of his own body in it. The floor beneath his feet felt solid and familiar, the air carrying faint traces of cleaning products and the faintest hint of morning coffee from a neighbor's apartment. He moved through the lobby slowly, deliberately, conscious of each step, of the quiet, of the presence of the building, now something akin to the house, though less intimate, less demanding. Reaching his apartment door, he inserted the key and felt the metal yield beneath his fingers, turning with smooth efficiency. He stepped inside, closing the door behind him gently. The apartment was still quiet, still waiting, though not in the way the house had waited. Here, the silence was neutral, unintentional, merely the absence of sound rather than the presence of attention. Ethan placed his bag on the floor and removed his coat, letting the movements be slow, deliberate, mindful. He moved to the window, pulling aside the curtain to let in the growing light. The street below was beginning to fill with people, early commuters heading to work, joggers running in pairs or alone, delivery vehicles rolling by with measured consistency. The world was moving, and he was part of it again, yet he carried with him the memory of the house, its patience, its endurance, and the way it had allowed him to rest when he had finally returned. The glass of his window reflected his face faintly, features softened by shadow and morning light. He examined himself carefully, noting the lines in his face, the gray in his hair, the subtle shifts that time had brought. He saw not only the physical markers of age, but the subtle shifts of presence, of awareness, of patience carried in the way he held himself, breathed, and moved. He realized that returning to the house had not only reconnected him with a place, but with a deeper sense of his own continuity, his own ability to exist fully in the present while acknowledging the past.
Ethan stayed at the desk a long while, letting the faint hum of the city seep into his awareness without forcing attention on it. He absent-mindedly traced the edge of one notebook, feeling the worn texture beneath his fingertips, imagining the hands that had written in it years ago. Hands younger, impatient, eager, unsteady. It was strange how those lines on the page had survived time almost perfectly, as if the words themselves were anchored in the same patient rhythm that the house had maintained. He wondered if memory itself could be preserved in that way, layered, patient, waiting for the moment it would finally be recognized. The sun climbed higher, brightening the room, scattering shadows that had lingered in corners. Ethan let the warmth wash over him, chest rising and falling in sync with the quiet rhythm he had learned to inhabit. He moved from the desk to the window once more, watching a pair of joggers pass along the street below. Their movements were synchronized, deliberate, unhurried yet purposeful. There was a kind of quiet determination in their motion that reminded him of his own deliberate return to the house, the careful acknowledgement of presence and continuity. A soft creak of the floor beneath his feet reminded him that he was not alone in the apartment, though there was no one else here. The sound was familiar, grounding, a subtle echo of the house he had left behind, the way it had responded to his presence without needing to declare itself. He walked slowly toward the living room, settling onto the couch with his legs stretched out, hands folded loosely in his lap. He didn't need to act, to plan, or to anticipate. For the first time in years, he simply existed in a space that acknowledged him fully, without demand or interruption. His thoughts drifted back to the night he had returned, to the quiet acknowledgement of the house, the subtle shifts, the patient stillness. It had not been anger or judgment he had encountered, but recognition. The house had endured, preserving its own memory while simultaneously absorbing his absence and return. He realized that this endurance was a kind of dialogue, one without words but complete in its form, a constant conversation held in silence and observation. He had expected confrontation, explanation, reckoning, but instead he had been granted something more enduring, understanding without articulation, presence without obligation. Ethan rose and moved toward the kitchen again, pouring himself another glass of water, letting the cool liquid settle in his chest as he drank slowly. He paused, listening to the faint sounds around him, the distant hum of a car engine on the street, the faint rustle of leaves brushing against the building, the subtle resonance of the apartment settling under its own weight. He carried the glass back to the living room, setting it gently on the coffee table. He watched the city below through the window, noting the small details that had always gone unnoticed. A window half open with curtains fluttering, the shadow of a street sign stretching across the pavement, a stray leaf tumbling along the sidewalk. These observations were small, almost imperceptible, yet they grounded him, connected him to the world outside without disrupting the awareness he carried from the house. Ethan settled back onto the couch, eyes half closed, feeling the quiet tension of years beginning to release from his shoulders and spine. The memory of 2:17 a.m. lingered, but it no longer carried urgency. Instead, it rested as a reference point, a moment of return and recognition that had reshaped his understanding of presence, absence, and patience. He realized that this endurance was a kind of dialogue, one without words but complete in its form, a constant conversation held in silence and observation. Ethan rose and moved toward the kitchen again, pouring himself another glass of water, letting the cool liquid settle in his chest as he drank slowly. He paused, listening to the faint sounds around him, the distant hum of a car engine on the street, the faint rustle of leaves brushing against the building, the subtle resonance of the apartment settling under its own weight. He carried the glass back to the living room, setting it gently on the coffee table. He watched the city below through the window, noting the small details that had always gone unnoticed. A window half open with curtains fluttering, the shadow of a street sign stretching across the pavement, a stray leaf tumbling along the sidewalk. These observations were small, almost imperceptible, yet they grounded him, connected him to the world outside without disrupting the awareness he carried from the house. Ethan settled back onto the couch, eyes half closed, feeling the quiet tension of years beginning to release from his shoulders and spine. The memory of 2:17 a.m. lingered, but Ethan remained on the couch, letting the quiet of the apartment envelop him as evening began to stretch its muted shadows across the walls. The light had softened into a gentle amber, filtering through the curtains in thin, warm bands. He didn't reach for a notebook, didn't rise to busy himself with tasks. Instead, he allowed his awareness to drift, lightly tethered to the pulse of the city outside, the subtle hum of distant traffic, the faint rustle of leaves stirred by a soft wind. Everything moved around him, yet he remained still, observing without urgency, aware without interference. He thought of the house again, not as a physical structure, but as a presence that had endured years of absence without complaint. Its patient quiet had guided him, shaped him, allowed him to return to a rhythm of attention and mindfulness that he hadn't realized he'd been missing. The house had not demanded apologies or explanations. It had merely waited, steadfast and aware, and in doing so had given him the space to reconcile with himself. A soft sound came from the hallway, a shift in the floorboards, subtle but deliberate. He recognized it immediately, though he was alone in the apartment. The sound carried no threat, no surprise, only recognition. It reminded him of the house, the patient adjustments that had accompanied his every movement that night, the silent awareness that had been present long before he stepped inside. Ethan closed his eyes briefly, letting the memory wash over him. He rose eventually, stretching slowly, deliberately. Each movement felt significant, measured, as if he were tracing the rhythm of presence itself. He moved to the window, leaning lightly against the frame, and observed the streets below. The sun was setting fully now, painting buildings in shades of gold and rose. Pedestrians hurried home, cars moved steadily, and the distant murmur of life carried upward, filling the apartment with its soft pulse. The world outside moved on, but within him a deeper stillness persisted. Ethan returned to the kitchen to pour a glass of water, listening to the faint flow as it filled the glass. He held it for a moment, allowing the cool liquid to remind him of his corporeal presence, the weight and grounding of a body returned to attentiveness. He drank slowly, savoring the quiet sensation, the continuity of sensation across time. Every small action became a practice of mindfulness, an acknowledgement of the rhythm that had been established the night before. Returning to the living room, he sat on the couch once more. The light had dimmed further, and shadows pooled in corners with a gentle softness. He allowed himself to observe without analysis, noticing the subtle details, the angle of the lamp casting lines across the carpet, the faint reflection of the fading sky on the window glass, the slight creak of the floor as it settled beneath his weight. Each detail was familiar, yet alive, part of a continuum he had returned to after years of absence. He leaned back, closing his eyes. Memories came without intrusion, the creak of the stairs, the subtle hum of the refrigerator, the faint smell of old wood. He felt these memories not as ghosts or regrets, but as guides, shaping his awareness in the present moment. The house had preserved these elements, had waited with them, had allowed him to return and experience them fully, with understanding rather than fear. Ethan rose again, moving slowly to the desk. The notebooks remained where he had left them, waiting patiently.
He opened the top one, flipping through pages, not seeking answers, but witnessing continuity. The words of his younger self appeared in uneven, energetic script, reflecting urgency, impatience, and curiosity. Each line resonated differently now, imbued with the awareness of time, of return, of patience. He traced a finger lightly over a passage. It waits for me, even when I forget, even when I leave, it remembers. He let the words linger, allowing them to echo in his mind. He realized that this had been the essence of his return, not reclaiming what was lost, but recognizing what had endured, what had been preserved in his absence, what had guided him back without interference or demand. Ethan set the notebook down and returned to the couch, letting himself sink fully into the cushions. The evening deepened, the city outside glowing with scattered lights, soft and warm. He allowed himself to exist in the convergence of memory, awareness, and presence. The house, the night, the 2:17 a.m. acknowledgement, they were no longer external pressures, but internal companions, integrated into his consciousness. Time moved slowly. He didn't measure it. He didn't need to. Awareness of presence replaced urgency. Continuity replaced anxiety. The quiet endurance of memory and environment formed a rhythm he could inhabit fully, without expectation or demand. Each breath, each slight adjustment of posture, each soft glance toward the fading light outside became an act of acknowledgement.
Ethan remained on the couch as night settled fully over the city, the amber glow of streetlights bleeding softly into the apartment. The hum of distant traffic had grown fainter, replaced by subtler sounds, the rustle of leaves brushing against the building's exterior, the occasional bark of a dog, a lone car passing far down the street. The rhythm of the world outside moved at its own pace, and yet within the apartment, time felt expansive, stretched in a way that allowed for observation without expectation, presence without demand. He rose slowly and walked to the window again, resting his hands lightly on the sill. His eyes followed the paths of distant streetlights, the movement of shadows, the flicker of light through partially drawn curtains. He noticed details that had escaped him in the rush of earlier days, the subtle angles of rooftops, the tiny glimmer of reflection on a distant window, the gentle sway of tree branches catching the faint breeze. The world was alive, but not urgent. It moved alongside him in a quiet synchronization, allowing space for him to exist fully within its current. A full memory brushed across his mind. The first night he had returned to the house, the notebooks lying in the closet, the quiet awareness of the walls around him. That awareness had been neither threatening nor commanding. It had simply been present. He realized now that he had carried it with him into the city, woven into his consciousness as a subtle guide, a quiet rhythm that shaped perception and attention. The house's patience had become his own, an enduring thread that allowed him to observe without interruption and to exist without pressure. He returned to the living room, settling back onto the couch. The notebooks remained unopened on the desk nearby, each page a silent witness to his past self, each line a testament to curiosity, uncertainty, and the slow unfolding of understanding. Ethan did not feel compelled to revisit them immediately. Instead, he allowed the presence of memory to hover gently in the space around him, a companion that required neither scrutiny nor response. The room darkened further as the streetlights outside cast longer shadows. Ethan closed his eyes, leaning back, and let awareness deepen. He felt the weight of the evening settle across his shoulders, the subtle gravity of presence filling him with a sense of continuity and alignment. The quiet endurance of the house, the patient acknowledgement of 2:17 a.m.,
the preserved memory of absence and return, all merged into a singular, steady rhythm that pulsed through him. He rose again, moving toward the kitchen. The act of pouring a glass of water became deliberate, meditative. The sound of liquid filling the glass was soft, grounding, each movement echoing the slow rhythm of awareness he had carried from the house. He drank carefully, letting the cool sensation anchor him to the present moment. The ordinary act of sustenance became extraordinary in its simplicity, a testament to patience, continuity, and the quiet power of attention. Returning to the couch, he sat with his back straight, hands resting lightly on his knees. The city outside had grown quiet, its pulse subdued but persistent. He allowed himself to observe fully the subtle glimmer of light reflecting off distant windows, the occasional movement of a pedestrian passing through a dimly lit street, the soft chorus of wind rustling leaves. The world was alive, but not urgent. It moved alongside him in a quiet synchronization, allowing space for him to exist fully within its current. Ethan's thoughts drifted naturally toward reflection. He considered the passage of time, the weight of absence, and the endurance of memory. The house had taught him that presence was not a matter of force or control, but of patience, of silent acknowledgement, of quiet endurance. That understanding had reshaped his perception of the world, allowing him to inhabit moments fully, without urgency, without distraction, and without fear. He allowed himself to close his eyes once more, sinking into the depth of evening awareness. The faint hum of the city, the soft shifting of shadows, the subtle rhythm of life outside, all blended seamlessly with the internal pulse of memory and recognition he carried. The notebooks, the house, the night at 2:17 a.m., all existed as threads in a tapestry of presence that moved fluidly through time, unbroken, patient, enduring. Hours seemed to pass with gentle fluidity. Ethan did not measure them. He did not anticipate them. Instead, he allowed the quiet continuity of the evening to shape his awareness. Each breath, each subtle shift in posture, each movement of the shadows across the room became an act of mindfulness, a practice in observing without interruption, in existing without compulsion. Eventually, he rose, walking slowly toward the desk. The notebooks called softly, though not urgently. He opened the top one and flipped through several pages, reading without haste, absorbing without pressure. Lines written years ago now resonated differently, infused.
Ethan did not fall asleep right away. He stayed where he was, eyes closed, aware of the precise weight of his body against the couch, the subtle resistance of fabric, the slow rise and fall of his chest. The apartment held its temperature steadily, neither too warm nor too cool, as if it understood the importance of not demanding attention. The city outside had reached a deeper quiet now, not silence, but a sustained low hum that felt structural, like something holding everything else in place. His thoughts moved without edges. They did not push or pull. They drifted, forming and dissolving in a rhythm that matched his breathing. He became aware of how rare that felt, to think without direction, to exist without anticipating the next necessary action. The night allowed it. The space allowed it. He allowed it. A faint sound traveled through the apartment then, not sudden, not sharp, just the quiet click of cooling metal somewhere within the walls, followed by a soft settling that rippled outward and faded. Ethan opened his eyes, not startled, only attentive. The sound reminded him of the house again, not as a memory exactly, but as a learned language. Structures speaking in small, practical ways, evidence of continuity rather than intrusion. He sat up slightly, adjusting the pillow behind his lower back. The movement felt deliberate but unremarkable, and the apartment responded in kind, no resistance, no commentary.
The shadows along the walls shifted subtly, redrawn by the angle of his posture. He watched them for a moment, noting how they held shape without intention, changing only when something else changed first. Time passed. He did not check his phone. Instead, he listened more closely to the layers of sound outside. A distant train horn stretched thin by distance, the faint hiss of tires on asphalt several blocks away, the occasional murmur of voices passing beneath his window and disappearing just as quickly. Each sound arrived, existed, and left without leaving residue. He admired that, the clean completeness of it. Eventually, he stood. The movement was slow, careful, as though speed might fracture the balance he had found. He crossed the room barefoot, the floor cool and solid beneath his feet, and stopped near the bookshelf. His fingers hovered over the spines, not selecting anything, just registering their presence. Objects did not demand purpose. They existed, and that was enough. He turned toward the hallway, paused, then walked its length, observing how the lighting changed with each step. The apartment narrowed there, the ceiling slightly lower, the air subtly different. Transitional spaces always carried a distinct feeling, neither one place nor another, designed to be passed through rather than occupied. He lingered anyway. Standing there, he realized something quietly unsettling. He no longer felt watched, not by the house, not by memory, not even by himself. The realization didn't bring relief so much as recalibration. He had grown accustomed to being observed internally, monitored by old expectations and unresolved thoughts. Their absence left a wide, unfamiliar openness. He breathed into it, testing its stability. It held. He reached the bathroom and turned on the light. The sudden brightness did not shock him, it simply revealed. His reflection met him in the mirror, older than the version who had written the earliest notebook entries, steadier than the man who had returned to the house. His eyes looked clearer now, not because something had been solved, but because something had stopped asking. He studied his face without judgment, the lines at the corners of his eyes, the faint shadow beneath them, the subtle asymmetry he had never noticed before. This, too, was presence, seeing without editing. He turned off the light and retraced his steps, letting the hall.
Sleep did not arrive all at once. It edged closer in stages, subtle and unannounced, like darkness deepening without ever fully declaring itself night. Ethan remained aware of the room even as his thoughts loosened, even as the distinction between attention and rest softened. His breathing stayed slow, deliberate, but no longer controlled. It moved on its own now, a quiet mechanism continuing without instruction. The apartment adjusted around him. Somewhere below, a door opened and closed. Footsteps crossed a hallway, muted by distance and structure. Pipes whispered briefly, then fell silent again. Each sound passed through the space without disturbing it, absorbed into the larger stillness that held everything together. Ethan's eyes remained closed, but his awareness drifted, widening rather than narrowing. He felt the couch beneath him, not as a surface, but as a shape supporting his weight exactly where it needed to. His shoulders settled more deeply into the cushion. The tension he hadn't realized he was holding released without ceremony. Images formed behind his eyelids, but they weren't dreams yet. They were impressions. Shadows moving across walls, the outline of a doorway, a staircase descending into dimness, not threatening, not inviting, simply present. He did not assign meaning to these shapes. He let them exist as shapes, no more, no less. Time blurred. The clear line between minutes dissolved into something softer, more fluid. He could no longer say how long he had been resting, only that rest itself had become the dominant state. Thought thinned, sensation deepened. At some point, there was no clear marker,
His awareness dipped further. He dreamed, but gently. There was a room, not the house, not the apartment, a room without defining features, lit evenly, with no visible source of light. The air felt neutral, calm. The room did not ask him to move, and he did not feel compelled to stay. It simply existed around him. He stood there, neither young nor old, neither returning nor leaving. The floor beneath his feet was solid, familiar in a way that bypassed memory. The walls were smooth, uninterrupted. No doors, no windows, no exit, but no confinement either. The space felt complete, as though it had already accounted for every version of him that might enter it. He understood, without words, that this room did not belong to a place. It belonged to a moment. The dream did not progress. It held. And within that holding, Ethan felt something settle fully for the first time. A sense of alignment so quiet it almost escaped notice. Not resolution, not closure. Something simpler. Stability. The dream faded without collapsing. The room did not disappear. It receded, like a thought set gently aside rather than erased. Awareness returned in layers. Sensation first, then sound. A bird called faintly outside. The sound was distant, uncertain, as if testing the morning rather than announcing it. Ethan's eyes remained closed, but his breathing shifted slightly in response. The night had begun its withdrawal, subtle and unforced. Light pressed faintly against the edges of the curtains, not enough to illuminate the room, but enough to change its shape. Shadows softened, corners lost their sharpness. The ceiling above him no longer felt infinite, it felt close, protective, defined. Ethan did not move immediately. He stayed in the space between sleep and waking, aware of both without belonging fully to either. His body felt heavier now, anchored by rest rather than fatigue. The dream room lingered as a sensation rather than an image, a memory of balance rather than narrative. Another sound filtered in, distant traffic resuming its low murmur, the city stretching awake, not abruptly, but gradually, as if careful not to disturb itself. Ethan opened his eyes. The living room appeared exactly as he had left it, same angle of furniture, same quiet order, same faint glow at the window. Nothing had shifted significantly during the night, and yet everything felt subtly recalibrated, as though the space had exhaled while he slept. He lay still, taking inventory. No tightness in his chest, no immediate thought demanding attention, no urgency pulling him forward, just awareness, present and evenly distributed. He flexed his fingers slowly, feeling sensation return more clearly, then his toes. The simple act grounded him further, anchoring him fully in the moment. The clock on the wall ticked softly. He noticed it only because it was no longer intrusive. It marked time without pressuring him to follow. He didn't check the hour. It didn't matter yet. Ethan rolled onto his back, staring at the ceiling again. The texture seemed different in morning light, less abstract, more tangible. He followed a faint crack with his eyes, tracing its path without interpretation. This, too, was a kind of meditation. Eventually, he sat up. The movement felt unforced, unhurried. His joints protested mildly, then settled. He swung his legs over the side of the couch and placed his feet on the floor, pausing there, letting the temperature register. The coolness sharpened his awareness pleasantly. He stood and stretched, arms rising overhead, spine lengthening. The motion drew a quiet response from his body, a release, a gentle alignment. He lowered his arms and exhaled slowly. Morning had arrived. Not dramatically, not ceremoniously. It had simply taken its place. Ethan walked to the window and pulled the curtain back a few inches. Pale light filtered in, revealing the street below in muted color. A delivery truck idled at the corner. A person walked a dog at an unhurried pace. Somewhere, a window opened. Life resumed. He watched without detachment, without absorption, present but not pulled, connected but not entangled. He stepped back from the window and turned toward the kitchen. The idea of coffee surfaced, not as habit.
Ethan poured the hot water slowly, watching steam curl upward and dissipate into the kitchen air. The sound was steady, controlled, a narrow stream meeting ceramic with a muted hiss. He waited a moment before lifting the mug, letting the heat settle, letting the smell rise fully. Morning had weight now, substance. He carried the mug back into the living room and sat at the edge of the couch rather than sinking into it. His posture felt different, more vertical, more deliberate, not alert in a defensive way, but aligned, as if his body had quietly agreed to participate in the day rather than endure it. He took a careful sip. The warmth spread through his chest, unremarkable and grounding. He let his eyes move across the room again, cataloging nothing in particular, just registering presence. The apartment felt unchanged, yet subtly recontextualized. Not a refuge, not a holding space, simply a place he occupied, honestly. Outside, the light continued to strengthen. The city's sounds layered themselves more densely now, engines starting, voices overlapping, the distant rhythm of workdays reasserting themselves. None of it felt intrusive. The noise existed at the perimeter of his awareness, no longer demanding interpretation. He stood and walked the room again, this time with purpose, though not urgency. He straightened a stack of papers on the desk, aligned a chair that had drifted slightly off-center. These were not corrections. They were acknowledgments, small gestures of engagement. At the desk, he paused, looking down at the notebooks. Their presence felt different in daylight, less enigmatic, less charged. They no longer felt like containers of something unresolved. They were records, useful, finite. He opened one again, not flipping randomly this time, but starting near the middle. The handwriting steadied there, less frantic than earlier pages, though still uncertain. He read without judgment, absorbing the cadence of his former thoughts. A line caught his attention. I keep waiting for a moment that tells me it's safe to move. He didn't react immediately. He let the words sit between him and the morning light, considering them without argument. Then he closed the notebook gently, the decision unforced. The moment had never been external. He returned the notebook to its place and pushed the chair in, aligning it with the desk. The action felt complete, final without being terminal. Some chapters did not need revisiting once their lesson had been absorbed. He finished his coffee standing by the window, watching the street fill in. The delivery truck pulled away. Another replaced it. The dog walker disappeared down the block. Patterns formed, dissolved, reformed. Movement without narrative. When the mug was empty, he rinsed it and set it upside down on the rack. He didn't leave it soaking. He didn't delay. The task ended cleanly. Ethan checked his phone then, not out of compulsion, but curiosity. Messages waited, notifications stacked quietly. He scanned them without responding, noting what mattered and what could wait. The distinction felt clearer now. He put the phone down again. There was time. He sat once more on the couch, but this time not to rest, to prepare. He didn't know for what exactly, and that uncertainty no longer bothered him. Readiness did not require a defined objective. It required presence, nothing more. His breathing remained even. His thoughts remained spacious. The residue of the night, of patience, of quiet acknowledgement, had not evaporated with the morning. It had integrated. A thought surfaced then, slow and unforced. He would return to the house again someday. Not to seek confirmation, not to listen for signs, simply to be there, briefly, honestly, without expectation. The idea felt neither heavy nor sentimental, just factual. For now, this was enough. He stood, retrieved his jacket from the chair, and slipped it on. The fabric settled across his shoulders naturally. He checked his keys by touch rather than sight, feeling their weight in his pocket. At the door, he paused, not because he needed to, but because the pause felt appropriate. He placed his hand on the knob and noticed its coolness, its solidity. Another structure, another system, another thing designed to open when turned. He opened the door and stepped into the hallway. The building smelled faintly of cleaning solution and old paint. Footsteps echoed somewhere above him. An elevator chimed distantly. The world extended upward and downward, layered with lives intersecting invisibly. He walked toward the stairs instead of the elevator, taking them at an unhurried pace. Each step registered fully beneath his feet. No rushing, no drifting. Outside, the air felt sharper. Ethan didn't wake so much as surface. His eyes opened slowly, lids heavy, as if sleep had weight and didn't want to release him all at once. The room was still dark, unchanged, yet the quality of the darkness felt different, less watchful, more settled. His breathing remained deep for a few moments before he became aware of it, and when he shifted slightly, there was no immediate tension in his body, no urgency, no pull. That alone felt unfamiliar. He stayed where he was, lying on the bed, listening. The house was quiet in a way that felt earned, not imposed. The silence had layers still, but they were resting layers now, folded rather than stretched thin. He had the sense of having arrived at the middle of something rather than the beginning or the end. He sat up and rubbed his face, palms warm against his skin. His thoughts felt slower, heavier, like furniture that had finally been set down after being carried too far. When he swung his legs over the side of the bed, the floor remained still beneath his feet. No creak, no acknowledgement this time. That, too, felt intentional. He stood and glanced at the closet. The door was still open, the box still where he'd left it. He didn't feel compelled to touch it again. What it held had already done its work for now. Some truths didn't need repetition. Downstairs, the living room waited without pressure. The couch, the table, the windows, all of it felt less like a museum and more like a place that had resumed breathing after a long pause. He crossed to the front window and pulled the curtain aside slightly. The street outside was empty, the sky beginning to soften at the edges. Dawn was still some distance away, but the night had begun to loosen its grip. He checked his phone out of habit, the screen lighting his face briefly. 2:18 a.m. The number sat there without significance now, no tightening in his chest, no sharp awareness, just time, moving forward the way it was supposed to. He lowered the phone and let his forehead rest lightly against the glass. The coolness grounded him, tethered him to the present moment. For the first time in a long while, he felt the quiet confidence of someone who hadn't fled from his own thoughts. Behind him, the house shifted, not in response, but in accompaniment, a shared movement, a parallel adjustment. "I'm not leaving tonight," he said softly. The words felt careful but firm, shaped by honesty rather than impulse. Saying them didn't spark anxiety, it brought relief. He moved toward the kitchen and poured himself a glass of water from the tap. The sound of it filling the glass felt ordinary in the best way. He drank slowly, then set the glass down and leaned back against the counter, eyes half closed. Memories came again, but differently now, not sharp, not demanding. They drifted through him with the distance of things that had already been acknowledged. He remembered mornings here, quiet ones, before school, before arguments, before he learned how to leave emotionally, long before he left physically. He wondered when exactly that had happened. Not the departure, but the detachment. The house had felt it before he had. He carried the glass into the living room and set it on the table, then lowered himself onto the couch. This time, when he leaned back, the fabric felt supportive rather than sagging. He closed his eyes and let his head rest against the cushion.
sleep returned almost immediately. It wasn't deep or consuming. It hovered close, like a trusted presence waiting to be invited. Ethan didn't analyze it, he simply allowed it, letting his breathing slow, his thoughts loosen their grip. A faint sound filtered through the quiet then, wind moving through branches outside, brushing against the house's exterior. The structure responded with a subtle settling, not alarmed, not alert, just responsive. He slept. Not long, not deeply, but honestly. When he opened his eyes again, the darkness had thinned. Early light pressed faintly against the windows, turning shadows softer, less absolute. The house felt different in daylight's approach, not diminished, but complete, like something that had finished a long-held task. Ethan sat up, joints stiff but manageable, and stretched slowly. His body registered the passage of time without protest. He felt present in it, anchored. He stood and walked the perimeter of the room, touching the backs of chairs, the edge of the bookshelf, the wall near the staircase. Each contact felt like a closing loop rather than a reopening wound. The house didn't resist. It didn't cling. At the base of the stairs, he paused. "I won't disappear again," he said, choosing the words carefully. The air held that statement without reaction. Acceptance didn't need confirmation. He moved toward the kitchen and retrieved his shoes from by the door and slipped them on, the action feeling neither hurried nor hesitant. When his hand rested on the doorknob, he paused one last time, not out of fear, but respect. "I'll come back," he said. This time it felt like a promise rather than a test. He opened the door and stepped outside. The cool air greeted him, fresh and awake, carrying the faint sounds of a world resuming its routines. He turned and looked at the house in the growing light. It stood quietly, unchanged in shape, altered in presence, complete.